Let me tell you the truth about the proposed Australian-UK free trade deal. Now, you might think that you've got better things to do than to sit there and listen to me bollock on about the Australian-UK free trade deal. There's probably a wall of paint somewhere that you'd rather watch dry, or a sock drawer to rearrange, or some thumbs to twiddle. But you see, that's what they want. Boris Johnson and his chums don't want you to scrutinise things. They want you to go along with the optics and question nothing and remain in a state of perpetual ignorance. They want you to think that Brexit is going swimmingly and that this incredible deal will replace the failing EU project and make us top global dog once more. To that end, they've even got their mates in the Sun newspaper to make a nice graphic explaining that your Vegemite will now be 8% cheaper, and your Tim Tams too. Let's talk about the numbers that actually matter instead. Whatever you might have been told or believed about the failing EU project, it remains the world's second largest economy and still by far our largest trading partner, despite Brexit. In 2019, our exports into it were worth £294 billion and accounted for 43% of our outward trade. Since leaving the EU, that figure's dipped, but it remains our biggest market and is usefully on our doorstep, so that makes sense. Unfortunately, all of that poses a bit of an existential crisis for the Brexiteers, because leaving the EU, after all, was about making trade deals with the rest of the world and reconnecting with the neglected Commonwealth and regaining our place as a top player. And that's why Australia matters. British people like Australia. It makes them think of warm seas, sandy beaches, barbecues and nice weather. Kylie Minogue, clean-cut soap operas and the comedy stylings of Dame Edna Everage. They also have our flag on their flag, our Queen on their money, and they drive on the left. Boris Johnson needs a Brexit win, and Australia, a nation so beloved of British people, looks like the obvious candidate. It ticks all the boxes and makes for some great Sun front page spreads. But there's a problem. Actually, there's a whole fucking Pandora's box of problems. Firstly, there's the distance. You see, it's one thing to export goods tariff-free across the English Channel, quite another to send them 944,000 miles. Quite apart from the CO2 emissions, there are added costs and added logistics, and all of that amounts to a huge headache. And, super awkward as it might be, we do not export that much to Australia in the first place, which is why we've never really needed a free trade agreement with them in the first place. The proposed deal could help boost Scottish whisky trade and maybe the London beer trade that currently exports about £40 million worth of beer to Australia. But the government's own figures show that the deal, at best, would only increase exports to Australia by, drumroll, 7% and add 0.01% to GDP over the next 15 years. Now, 0.01% of gross value added to the UK economy is what Harrods department store in Knightsbridge does annually. Currently, the only people likely to benefit from this deal are Australian farmers. For while the rise in UK exports to Australia is negligible, the boost in trade the other way could rise by about 83%. So this deal benefits Australia, but it doesn't really benefit the UK. And that means cheap beef and lamb being exported into the UK market. Australia is the second largest producer of beef and lamb in the world, and the UK is a ready-made export market ripe for exploitation. Were their farmers to be granted tariff-free access to the UK, they'd be able to flood the market with cheap imports that would basically undercut domestically produced meat. That would have a devastating effect on farming, and particularly on hill farmers in Wales and Scotland. At its worst, it could wipe out the market beyond rare breed and top end, for example, organic meat. As with poultry, British lamb and beef is produced to the highest standards of welfare in the world, courtesy of all those years of EU membership. Australian meat, by contrast, while good, is reared fast and cheap and often treated with growth hormones that have long been banned in the EU. So not only would British domestic production be decimated, but we would also be eating inferior beef and lamb, reared to standards previously outlawed in this country. All of that for the sake of a 0.01% injection into the UK economy, or best case 0.02% over 15 years. Now the government admits this all in the small print. They say that the deal is a first step into the Asia-Pacific free trade area. But again, I ask you this, why are we swapping arguably the best deal on earth with the world's second biggest economy that sits literally on our doorstep for one with a trade area thousands of miles away, made up of some of the dodgiest regimes on earth? No deal can replace the one that we have with the EU. That's not Ramona talk, it's plain and obvious fact to anyone who looks, and the government knows that, and their friendly stable of tamed tabloid journalists know that too. And it is essential to both camps that you don't work it out, that you are kept in a state of perpetual ignorance and instead cheer huzzah for the thin gruel on offer. The free trade agreement with Australia is about nothing more than optics and about tapping into those Brexit yearnings for a world in which Britain headed a great big empire and was top dog. None of this makes good economic sense, and none of this benefits the vast majority of people in Britain. Not even the most credulous Brexit believer. It's the politics of Johnsonism, a philosophy predicated on serving the ego and career of Boris and his acolytes and keeping the Tories in power. The government needs a trade deal with Australia because it needs a Brexit win. It needs to fuel the fantasy, much as the Aztecs believed that they needed to fuel the sun with human sacrifice, lest their whole world fall apart. Logic and sanity play no part in any of this, as long as they can get away with it. And they believe they can. Depressingly, I think they're probably right. So if you like the video and you want to see more like it, head over to our Patreon.